It was a combination of the passion for music had left me. I could not, and I think my voice was also suffering. I think everything started to suffer for me. The feeling just got very clear to me that I need to just stop, and I didn't know where I was going.
The room was quiet when he stopped singing, not because the song had ended, but because he chose not to continue. No announcement followed, no explanation, just a moment where something expected simply didn't happen. And for years after, people would argue about what that moment meant, without ever agreeing on what they'd actually seen. If you care about the real stories behind the legends, the moments they never explain, subscribe to RetroWaves. The silence didn't arrive all at once. It crept in slowly through canceled plans, postponed conversations, and questions that never seemed to land in the right place. For a long time, it wasn't even clear that anything was missing, only that something familiar had stopped showing up. He didn't announce a goodbye. He didn't close a door. He just stopped standing in it. At first, it felt temporary. That was the assumption everyone made. Rest, recovery, distance. The kinds of things artists take when the noise gets too loud. There was no reason to believe the absence meant anything permanent, not yet. And that was part of what made it so unsettling, because every time his name surfaced, it came attached to possibility. A phone call that almost happened, a rehearsal that was quietly discussed, a decision that lingered just long enough to feel real before dissolving again. People would say he was close, very close, closer than anyone realized, but when asked directly, he never gave them the moment they were waiting for. He spoke carefully, often indirectly, as if the truth sat somewhere just behind what he was willing to say. And that restraint, that measured distance, became its own kind of message. Years earlier, he had been everywhere. A voice that didn't need to explain itself. It arrived fully formed, confident, unmistakable. You didn't have to be told who it was. You knew within seconds, which made the quiet that followed even louder. The first time he nearly came back didn't feel like a return at all. It felt more like a pause ending, like the natural next step in a story that had simply taken a breath. There were conversations, studio doors reopened, songs were written with the assumption that they would be heard live. No one spoke about stakes, no one talked about consequences, they talked about music. That was always the safe ground, the place where everything still made sense. And for a while, it worked. The voice was still there, unmistakable, disciplined, intact, not untouched by time, but shaped by it. There was a seriousness in the way he approached it now. Less urgency, more care. Those close to him noticed something else too. He was listening more than he spoke, not just to the music, but to his own limits. There were moments when excitement crept in, not publicly, quietly, in the way plans were discussed just a little further ahead than before, in the way if started turning into when. But that wasn't the part that stayed with him. What stayed with him was the realization that returning didn't mean reclaiming something frozen in time. It meant stepping into motion again, and motion had consequences. That first almost return didn't collapse dramatically. It didn't explode or fracture or fall apart in public view. It simply stalled. And when it stalled, a question appeared that hadn't existed before. What happens if coming back costs more than leaving ever did? He didn't answer that question out loud, but he didn't ignore it either. So time passed, long enough for people to stop asking directly, long enough for assumptions to harden into narratives. long enough for the story to be retold without his voice in it. And still, every so often, something would disrupt the certainty. A quote that felt unfinished, a comment that hinted at unfinished business, a pause before he answered a question he'd been asked too many times. The second time almost happened much later. By then, the world had changed. So had the industry. So had expectations. The idea of coming back no longer meant returning to what once was. It meant re-entering something unfamiliar. That mattered to him. He wasn't afraid of singing. That had never been the issue. It was everything around the singing that made him hesitate. The pace, the repetition, the version of himself others wanted him to preserve. He had spent years protecting something fragile, not his reputation, but his relationship with the voice itself. The act of singing had become private again, personal, untethered from obligation, and now people wanted it back in public. He didn't say no. That's what confused people. He said things like, "I think about it. I miss it. I don't know." Each answer left room, enough room for hope to grow, and hope did grow, louder than he ever intended. But what followed was never explained publicly, only hinted at, only felt. Those close to him noticed that whenever the conversation drifted toward touring, his language changed, became more careful, more distant, as if he were describing something he loved, but from far away. As if proximity itself was the risk. At one point, he admitted that the idea of returning wasn't about fear, it was about weight. The weight of expectation, the weight of history, the weight of knowing that once he stepped back into that space, it would no longer belong to him alone. And that weight didn't lift just because time had passed, it pressed harder. So once again, the moment slipped. No announcement, no definitive statement, just silence, thick enough for others to fill, and they did. Speculation turned into certainty. Certainty turned into disappointment. Disappointment turned into blame, even though he never offered anyone a promise to break. Still, the question lingered. Why come so close and stop? Years later, when he spoke about it again, his tone wasn't defensive, it was reflective. He didn't frame the decision as a loss. He framed it as a boundary, one he hadn't known how to articulate earlier, but felt deeply all the same. And yet, even then, the story wasn't finished. Because there was a third moment, quieter than the others, easier to miss. It didn't involve a band, or a tour, or a public stage. It involved something smaller, and in many ways more revealing. A decision made privately, a song revisited, a door opened just enough to see inside, but not enough to walk through. And that hesitation, that final pause, carried more truth than anything he'd said before. Because by then, he wasn't avoiding the question anymore. He was circling it, carefully, deliberately, as if the answer wasn't about whether he could come back, but whether he should. The third moment didn't announce itself. There was no build-up, no headlines, no sense that anything significant was about to happen. It appeared quietly, in a studio session that wasn't meant to signal anything at all. Just a song, one voice, no expectations attached. At least, that's how it was presented. But for him, it felt different. Because this time, the decision wasn't being shaped by outside voices. There were no timelines, no reunion theories, no pressure to explain what it meant. He was singing because he wanted to hear himself sing, and that distinction mattered more than anyone realized. By then, he had lived long enough with absence that it had become familiar. Silence wasn't something to escape anymore. It was something he understood. It had edges now, shape, meaning. When people asked why he stayed away, he didn't talk about conflict. He didn't talk about disagreements or broken relationships. He spoke about alignment, or rather, the lack of it. He had learned something in the years after stepping back, something that only distance could teach, that the voice wasn't just an instrument, it was a responsibility. Every time he used it, publicly, it pulled him back into a version of himself that no longer fit. A version shaped by expectation, memory, and a kind of permanence he hadn't agreed to. So when he returned to the studio years later, it wasn't about reclaiming anything, it was about testing a boundary. Could he sing without reopening the past? Could he step into the sound without stepping into the role? The answer didn't arrive immediately. What followed was careful, deliberate, almost tentative. He chose collaborators who wouldn't ask him to be who he used to be. People who understood restraint, who didn't push for spectacle. The recordings that came out of this period didn't feel like announcements. They felt like letters, personal, controlled, measured, and listeners noticed. There was a stillness in his delivery that hadn't been there before. Not weakness, intention. He wasn't trying to overpower the moment anymore. He was sitting inside it. Some heard that as vulnerability. Others heard it as hesitation. But what it really was choice. Still, even then, the question hovered. If he could sing like this, privately, intentionally, why not take the next step? Why not step back into the light? People assumed the answer was fear. He never said that. What he said instead was quieter. He spoke about balance, about control, about how the act of singing had changed meaning for him. At one point, he acknowledged something he'd never said before, that the hardest part of returning wasn't the stage, it was the aftermath, the interviews, the interpretations, the way every note would be measured against a version of himself frozen decades earlier. He knew how that story went. He had lived it once, and he wasn't sure he wanted to live it again. What made this third almost return different wasn't proximity. It was clarity. For the first time, he wasn't being pulled back by nostalgia or expectation. He was being invited, gently, by the music itself. And still, he hesitated, because even an invitation can be declined. There were moments during this period when he seemed closer than ever. Not in the way people usually measure closeness, not through contracts or announcements, but through comfort. He spoke more openly, shared more reflections, allowed himself to acknowledge how much singing still meant to him. But he also admitted something else, that the version of himself people wanted back didn't exist anymore. Not because he had lost it, but because he had grown past it. And growth doesn't always translate well on stage. Some fans interpreted his restraint as teasing, others as indecision. But those who listened closely noticed a pattern. Whenever the conversation drifted toward return, he redirected it toward process, how he worked now, why he worked now, what mattered to him now, as if the destination was less important than the conditions, and those conditions were specific. He needed space. He needed autonomy. He needed to protect the relationship he had rebuilt with his own voice. That relationship had been fragile once. Years earlier, singing had become something he owed, not something he chose. Expectations wrapped around it until it felt heavier than it sounded. Stepping away hadn't been dramatic, it had been necessary. And now, standing at the edge of a possible return for the third time, he understood something he hadn't before. That coming back wasn't a single decision. It was a series of compromises, some of which he wasn't willing to make. So he chose something else, not absence, not silence, but limitation. He would sing, but on his terms. He would share, but selectively. He would return, but not fully. And for a while that seemed to be enough. Until another question surfaced, one he hadn't expected. If the reason he stayed away was protection, what was he protecting himself from now? That question didn't come from fans or journalists or collaborators. It came from him, and it lingered longer than the others, because this time the answer wasn't about pressure, it was about truth. And that truth, the one he had been circling for years, was finally close enough to touch. He didn't describe the moment right away. When he finally spoke about it, it was years later, and even then, he chose his words carefully. Not because he was hiding something, but because the truth didn't fit neatly into the story people expected. It wasn't about fear. It wasn't about bitterness. It wasn't about walking away from anyone. It was about staying close to himself. The third almost return came closest to clarity because by then, he had stopped negotiating with the past. He wasn't trying to fix anything. He wasn't trying to correct the record. He wasn't trying to step back into a role that once defined him. He was listening. And what he heard wasn't silence anymore. It was something quieter, but more demanding. He had spent years being identified by a sound that meant different things to different people. For some, it was youth. For others, certainty. For others still, a time in their lives they couldn't return to. He carried all of that with him, but none of it belonged to him anymore. That realization didn't arrive suddenly. It emerged slowly, through moments that seemed insignificant on their own. Singing alone without anyone listening. Recording without planning what would happen next. Letting a note fade without wondering how it would be received. Those moments taught him something important. That the voice he had protected all these years wasn't meant to be proven anymore. It was meant to be preserved. At one point, he acknowledged something he had never said so plainly before. That every time he considered returning fully, touring, repeating the cycle, re-entering the machine, he felt himself drifting away from the part of singing that mattered most to him. Not the performance, the connection. He had learned to sing again without obligation, without expectation, without the weight of delivering something that matched memory instead of reality. And once he found that, he didn't want to risk losing it. That was the emotional truth he had been avoiding, not because it was painful, but because it was final. Coming back wasn't a test he was afraid to fail. It was a version of success he no longer wanted. The third almost return wasn't about hesitation. It was about recognition. Recognition that the life he had built in quiet was not incomplete. That absence didn't mean loss. That stepping away had allowed something else to survive. When people asked him now if he would ever return, he didn't answer the way they expected. He didn't say never. He didn't say soon. He spoke about moments, about singing when it felt honest, about sharing when it felt necessary, about protecting what had taken him years to reclaim. There was no bitterness in his voice, only calm. And that calm said more than any announcement ever could. The truth was simple and deeply human. He didn't disappear because he couldn't sing anymore. He stepped back because singing had become too important to risk. And once he understood that, the almost returns stopped feeling unfinished. They became reminders of how close he came, of why he stopped, of what he chose instead. Not silence, but peace. And sometimes, When the song ends before anyone expects it to, it's not because something was taken away. It's because it was finally held gently enough to last.